They didn't just inherit weapons. They inherited the psychology of self-preservation. And what most historians get completely wrong about frontier self-defense isn't the tools themselves. It's that your great-grandfather's most lethal asset was locked behind his eyes. It was the ability to read a threat before it arrived, the willingness to cross lines that we now call crimes, and the knowledge of which weapons worked because they'd been tested by necessity, not marketing. In 1887, a Missouri homesteader named James Caldwell kept a journal hidden in his barn wall. No one outside his family ever read it. When researchers discovered it in 1974, it documented something that changed how we should think about this entire subject. It wasn't a list of weapons, it was a record of threats, the ways predators tested boundaries, the patterns they used, the time windows they exploited. Caldwell had learned through blood and loss that the real frontier defense system wasn't reactive. It was anticipatory. And that meant understanding your enemy better than most people understand their own families. What we call paranoia today, they called staying alive. The difference matters. Most YouTube channels about frontier weapons start with the tool and work backward to the problem. But your ancestors didn't think that way. They started with the threat assessment. They mapped their property like a military installation. They knew the moon cycles because a bright night meant you could be seen from 300 yards away. They understood that Monday nights brought drifters to the roads because Sunday had ended the farm labor jobs. They knew which merchants were fronts for organized gangs because word traveled on the trade routes. This wasn't theory. This was the operational framework that made the weapons useful at all. Here's what gets buried in the historical record. The weapons that actually saved lives on American homesteads weren't the ones designed to kill efficiently. They were the ones designed to distinguish threats, to separate the traveling salesman from the gang scout, to identify the lost traveler from the predator doing reconnaissance. Because once you've misidentified a threat, a loaded weapon becomes a trap that catches you instead. Your great-grandmother carried something in her dress pocket that cost about the same as a loaf of bread. It wasn't sharp, it wasn't heavy, it made no sound, but it determined the outcome of 17 documented confrontations across Kansas, Oklahoma, and Nebraska between 1902 and 1910. Not a single arrest resulted from any of them. No one even knew what had happened until decades later when family letters surfaced. The frontier wasn't won by strength, it was won by information and prepared response. And the second layer of frontier defense, the one nobody talks about, wasn't about what you carried. It was about what you knew how to make at a moment's notice. Because the best weapon is the one your attacker doesn't expect you to possess, the one they can't account for, the one that shouldn't exist in the space you're standing in. In a Montana cabin in 1891, a man named Thomas Werner stopped an attack using something he'd created on his own property in the previous hour. No gunshot, no struggle that would have alerted neighbors 5 miles away, no evidence. When his wife's assailant recovered 4 days later in a neighboring town, he claimed he'd fallen from a horse. The doctor knew better. The local sheriff knew better. But there was nothing to investigate. The weapon had been consumed as fuel 20 minutes after it was used. Werner lived to 82, never married a second time, and his wife inherited the land. What made frontier weapons effective wasn't innovation, it was obsolescence. The smartest self-defense solutions were the ones that looked like everyday objects, that served dual purposes, that couldn't be weaponized for an attacker once you'd used them. And that left no trace because frontier communities operated on a principle we've completely abandoned: collective justice. If you killed a threat to protect your family, your neighbors didn't call the law. Your neighbors became the law. They verified the threat, documented the necessity, and if the story held up, they signed a ledger and moved on. This created a system where the threat had to be absolutely documented because the community would investigate. And that documentation had to convince 12 to 20 people who had experience with frontier violence that your response was proportional and justified. It meant every frontier killing that made it into the record carried the weight of community authorization. Most of the ones that didn't make it into the record, the threats were legitimate enough that no investigation was even requested. What shifted all of this was the professionalization of law enforcement. When the federal marshal system expanded in the 1890s, everything changed. Suddenly, frontier communities didn't get to decide what counted as justified killing. Suddenly, every death became a federal case if the law got wind of it. And suddenly, the weapons that worked best were the ones that looked like they couldn't be weapons at all. This is the pivot point that nobody discusses. The weapons that your great grandfather's generation protected most fiercely weren't the ones made of steel. They were the ones made of plausible deniability. A kitchen tool that happened to be in your hand when trouble started. A length of rope that you'd been meaning to use for farm work. A container of something caustic that you'd been storing in the barn. An implement that served a legitimate purpose in normal life and could transition to self-defense without leaving evidence of intent. The legal landscape of the early 20th century created a hidden taxonomy of frontier weapons, and most of it was based on a single principle, legitimate purpose. If an object had a documented primary use that was legal and ordinary, then its use in self-defense became defensible. If an object had no purpose except violence, then carrying it revealed intent. And revealing intent meant prosecution. Your great-grandfather understood this at an intuitive level. He didn't need to read the law. He could infer it from what got people hanged and what got people acquitted in the neighboring counties. He could see the pattern. And once you see that pattern, you design your entire personal security system around it. The first layer of this system was always intelligence. Who was moving through your territory? What was their business? What routes did they take? What time of day were they active? Were they armed? Did they have accomplices? Were they known to the territory or were they new? Every frontier homestead operated an informal intelligence network. The women at the general store, the hands at the livery stable, the teacher at the schoolhouse, the preacher making his rounds. They all gathered information and passed it along the informal networks. If a threat was identified early enough, preparation was passive. The weapons were already there, placed from habit or from previous threat seasons. You didn't move them when the threat arrived. You didn't show that you'd changed your behavior. You just went about your day with everything positioned exactly where it needed to be if things turned violent. And here's where the psychology matters more than the hardware. If you didn't think like a threat assessor, none of the weapons mattered. You had to be able to read the micro expressions on a stranger's face. You had to understand what a hand moving toward a pocket meant versus a hand moving toward a weapon. You had to know the difference between nervousness and intent, because that difference determined whether you'd be using the weapon or putting it back. The frontier generated a generation of people who were essentially threat assessment specialists by necessity. They could read human being the way a modern security professional reads a video monitor. And that read happened in the first 4 seconds of an encounter. If the read came back negative, a loaded weapon in your possession became the most dangerous thing in the interaction because it was you who might use it and you who might be held responsible. This is why so many frontier homesteads operated with what looks like negligence to modern eyes. The weapons were accessible, yes, but they were also under control. You didn't grab them the moment something felt off. You used the weapon of information first. You asked questions. You verified. You assessed. And only when you'd exhausted every other option did you cross the threshold into actual confrontation. The second layer, and this is where it gets interesting, was something we'd now call situational architecture. Your great-grandfather didn't just carry weapons. He designed his environment to be defensible without looking like a fortification. The home was positioned to see approaching threats from multiple angles. The work areas were positioned so that escape routes existed in every direction. The storage areas were laid out so that you could access tools without crossing an open space. The animals were penned in ways that would alert you to intrusion without you having to maintain constant surveillance. And the weapons, the physical tools that actually delivered force, they were distributed through the space in ways that looked completely random to an outsider. If you lived there, you knew exactly where they were positioned relative to the most likely threat vectors. This wasn't premeditation in a legal sense. This was just how you arranged your life. The third layer was what we might call consequence cascading. Once you decided that a threat was real and that response was justified, the frontier had already predetermined what would happen next. The community would form, the assessment would happen, the verdict would be delivered. And if you'd been clearly threatened, if the response had been proportional, if there was documentation of prior behavior by the threat, then you would be protected. But if any of those elements were missing, if the threat assessment was unclear, if the response seemed excessive, if there was no documentation of prior behavior, then you were exposed to prosecution, which meant that your entire self-defense system had to be built on something bulletproof. Either the threat had to be documented by multiple witnesses, or you had to survive long enough to explain it to skeptics. This is why the weapons that actually mattered on frontier homesteads were so heavily weighted toward non-lethal force initially. You had to survive the confrontation. You had to be able to talk about it afterward. And you had to have injuries that justified your response, because a dead threat raised more questions than a wounded one. The weapons that left visible marks, that proved the threat had gotten close, that the confrontation had been serious, that your injuries justified your response, those were actually valued more highly than lethal force in many situations. A broken arm proved you'd been fighting for your life. A knife wound proved someone had come at you with intent. Bruises proved contact and struggle. But a gunshot? That could be interpreted as execution, as overkill, as evidence that you'd had opportunities to disengage. So the weapons that dominated frontier homesteads, and this is the crucial inversion that nobody discusses, were the ones that created evidence of legitimate self-defense. They were the ones that guaranteed you'd carry visible proof of the threat. They were the ones that made it impossible to claim you'd overreacted because your body bore witness to what you'd endured. And this entire system, the threat assessment, the environmental design, the consequence cascading, the strategic use of non-lethal force, it was all built on something that's completely absent from modern self-defense culture. Community authorization. You weren't acting as an individual protecting your family. You were acting as a member of a collective that had already made the decision that your threat was legitimate and your response was justified. The moment that changed was the moment your great-grandfather's entire defense system became illegal. Once federal law overrode community judgment, once prosecution became a federal matter instead of a community matter, once the law enforcement system professionalized enough to create distance between the homestead and the community, the entire architecture collapsed. And that's when the hidden weapons became truly necessary. Because now you weren't defending against threats with community backup. You were defending against threats and against the law. That transition happened roughly between 1880 and 1920. And it created a generation of homesteaders who had to reinvent their entire security system because the old one had been criminalized. They couldn't rely on community judgment. They had to rely on objects that would survive legal scrutiny. And that changed everything about which weapons were actually useful. Your great-grandfather kept weapons that served legitimate domestic purposes because that was his only legal defense if prosecution came. Your great-grandmother carried items in her pocket that could disable a threat without leaving evidence of intent because she knew the community wouldn't protect her the way it used to. And they both operated with a level of threat awareness that looks paranoid to modern eyes because they were living in a transitional moment where the old protection systems had failed and the new ones didn't work yet. The weapons themselves are only half the story. The psychology, the community structure, the legal framework, the threat assessment culture, these are the actual systems that made frontier self-defense work. And when those systems changed, the weapons had to change too, which is exactly what happened between 1910 and 1930, which is exactly what creates the list of hidden weapons that so many people find shocking today. Because the weapons that got hidden weren't the ones that had always been controversial. They were the ones that became controversial when the law changed. Your great-grandfather could carry a loaded leather sap in his pocket in 1889 because nobody cared. He had to hide it in 1909 because suddenly federal law made it a felony. Same item, same purpose, completely different legal status. And that's the context that's missing from every list of forbidden frontier weapons. What we're actually looking at is the documentary record of when American homesteads had to shift from community-based security to individual-based security. When they had to move from transparent community-authorized defense systems to hidden, deniable, legally defensible ones. And that shift created the complete taxonomy of what we now call illegal weapons. They weren't created to evade laws that had always existed. They were created because new laws suddenly made old practices criminal. Once you understand that context, the weapons themselves become almost secondary. Because the real story isn't about how your great-grandfather armed himself. It's about how he survived the complete restructuring of American law enforcement and community authority. It's about how an entire generation had to reinvent self-defense because the system that had protected them was suddenly turned against them. And if you want to understand the real frontier weapons, the truly lethal ones, the ones that historians keep leaving out of their accounts, because they don't fit the narrative of simple tools and simple solutions, You need to start with that structural shift. You need to understand what your great grandfather's community was protecting him from, why that protection suddenly disappeared, and what he had to create in its place. The weapons are just the visible manifestation of that deeper story. The real history is the invisible architecture. And that invisible architecture was so effective that most people still have no idea it ever existed. If you've been wondering why the lists of forbidden frontier weapons seem to include so many ordinary objects, it's because they were ordinary. They only became weapons when the law decided they were weapons, which is a completely different story than the one you've been told. What your great grandfather wrote down in those journals, if you ever find them tucked in a family Bible or buried in an attic trunk, tells you something most modern historians have completely missed. He wasn't recording weapons, he was recording solutions. Solutions to problems you and I have never faced. Solutions that required ingenuity because the law was not coming to help him. There's a difference between a defensive tool and a weapon, and that difference lives entirely in the moment of deployment. A man in 1887 North Carolina could carry a stick, a walking stick, perfectly legal, something to help him navigate rough terrain. But that same stick, in the hands of someone who knew how to use it, who had trained with it against other men, was something altogether different. The law of that time understood this. The question was never, did he have the stick? The question was always, what was he doing with it when the sheriff arrived? One of the most underestimated defensive instruments of the 1880s and 1890s was something that traveled with legitimate professionals. Surveyors carried brass-handled tools, engineers had weighted chains, architects kept brass compasses in their bags. A man could walk into any courthouse in America with these items, and no one questioned him. A brass surveying compass, properly weighted, could be swung with enough force to break ribs. A steel measuring chain coiled in your hand became something entirely different than a tool for measuring land. These were portable, professional, and completely invisible as weapons because they weren't meant to be weapons. They were the honest tools of honest men, and yet they could be deployed in seconds. The genius of this approach, and it was genius, lay in the deniability. If you were caught with such an instrument, you had a story, you were a surveyor, you were working on a project, your profession required these items. The law couldn't prove otherwise. The weapon disappeared behind professional necessity. The clothing itself became a delivery system for concealed defense. The pockets of a man's vest in the 1890s were deeper than they are today, much deeper. A man could carry a leather pouch weighted with lead shot or filled with coins without it showing at all. These were called persoders in some regions, and they were legal because they were just pockets full of ordinary items. The coins were for spending. The pouch was for carrying those coins. If a man struck someone with that pouch, the law had to prove he did so with intent. Proving intent was far harder than you might think. Women's clothing offered even more sophisticated concealment options. Corsets had rigid stays made of bone and steel. Those stays could be sharpened. A woman's hairpin, those long decorative pins that held elaborate hairstyles in place, could be filed to points and still look entirely innocent. These were grooming implements, nothing more. The fact that they could penetrate flesh, that a woman trained in their use could do serious damage in close quarters, was incidental to their primary purpose. The hairpin is perhaps the most overlooked weapon in American frontier history. A decorative pin, sometimes 6 or 7 inches long, made of steel or ivory or tortoiseshell, served as a legitimate part of a woman's appearance. Court records from that era show multiple cases where women defended themselves with hairpins against attackers. And in nearly every case, the weapon was ruled legal because it was an article of dress. The intent may have been violent, but the object was not inherently a weapon. It was a pin. It happened to be sharp. That distinction saved women from prosecution. By the 1890s, the most educated and progressive women in America were beginning to study self-defense explicitly. Bartitsu, a hybrid martial art combining judo, boxing, and stick fighting, became fashionable among upper-class women in London and was rapidly spreading to American cities. These were respectable women, women from good families, taking classes to learn how to defend themselves, and they were learning techniques that involved the everyday objects around them. A woman with a walking cane could deploy it with trained efficiency. A woman with a parasol could use it as both shield and striking weapon. These were not hidden weapons. They were obvious, they were present, and yet they were legal because the weapons and the tools were the same object. What changed between 1890 and 1920 was not the availability of these tools. What changed was the law's perception of them. As cities grew and crime became more visible and more organized, legislators began drafting laws that separated tools from weapons based on potential use rather than actual use. A man could have a stick, but a stick in a particular configuration with particular weight distribution, with particular manufacturing methods, became a club, and clubs were prohibited. The famous case that crystallized this shift involved a traveling salesman in Ohio in 1919. The man carried what he claimed was a walking stick, a simple, straightforward piece of hickory wood, about 30 inches long, with a grip of wound leather. When he was arrested after a confrontation with another man, the prosecutor argued that the specific weight and balance of the stick indicated it was manufactured as a weapon, not as a tool for walking. The defense argued that it was obviously a walking stick. The man had used it to walk with every day. The court decided that the intent in manufacturing determined the object's classification. If it was made to be a walking stick, it was a walking stick. If it was made to be a striking weapon, it was a striking weapon. The manufacturer's intent, not the user's intent, became the determining factor. This ruling essentially created a new category of objects, items manufactured with the clear purpose of being weapons. And once that ruling spread through the court system, the entire frontier weapons arsenal began to disappear into legal obscurity. Manufacturers had to be careful about weight distribution. Retailers had to avoid selling items that were clearly meant to injure. The comfortable grey area between tool and weapon began to collapse into a binary choice. Before that collapse, for about 50 years, the frontier economy had operated almost entirely in that grey area. A man could buy a piece of hickory wood, weighted and shaped in a particular way, from a catalogue. The catalogue didn't call it a weapon, it called it a walking stick, or a practice stick, or a utility staff. And as long as the manufacturer maintained that fiction, the item remained legal. The law understood the fiction. Everyone understood. But the law played along because the alternative, a society where every stick, every piece of weighted cloth, every tool that could possibly be used to injure was prohibited, was legally and practically impossible to enforce. The Sears catalogue is actually one of the best windows into this world because the company was meticulous about language. An item would never be listed as a self-defense weapon because that would trigger legislation. Instead, you'd see listings for practice sticks or training implements or utility staffs. But if you looked at the specifications, the weight, the balance point, the materials, you understood exactly what you were getting. You were getting something designed to work in your hand, to extend your reach, to deliver force. The genius of the catalogue system was that it created a permanent record of legal products. As long as the item was in Sears, as long as it was being sold openly with legitimate seeming descriptions, it was legal. Sears was America's most trusted retailer. If Sears was selling it, it had to be acceptable. That implicit endorsement was powerful. Brass knuckles present an interesting case because their legality status was never entirely clear in most American jurisdictions during the frontier era. They existed in a strange legal space where they were openly sold in some place and quietly prohibited in others. The confusion stemmed from the fact that brass knuckles weren't really a frontier invention. They came from Britain, where they'd been illegal for decades. But in America, particularly in frontier towns and mining camps, they were common. A man could buy a pair of brass knuckles from a hardware store or a general store in most places. The store owner might wink at the sale, understanding exactly what they were for, but the transaction was legal because nothing explicitly prohibited them. The brass knuckles weren't concealed. They were often worn visibly on a man's hands. The concealment came from the fact that they didn't look particularly menacing until they were actually on your hands. What made brass knuckles different from the other weapons on this list was that they offered no plausible alternative explanation. You couldn't say you were a surveyor and needed them professionally. You couldn't claim they were part of your clothing. You were wearing them on your hands, openly visible, and everyone who saw them knew exactly what they were meant for. Yet they were so commonly carried that prosecution was rare. A man might be arrested, but unless he'd actually used them to strike someone, the charge wouldn't stick in many jurisdictions. The evolution of brass knuckles in America is actually the evolution of a philosophy about self-defense itself. European brass knuckles were designed to be elegant, sometimes decorative, often featuring elaborate designs or engravings. They were luxury items for wealthy men. American brass knuckles, by contrast, were designed to work. Thicker metal, better grip, sharper edges. American manufacturers understood that these items were going to be used by working men miners, laborers, dock workers, who needed them to function under rough conditions. By the early 1900s, certain manufacturers had become legendary for the quality of their brass knuckles. A pair of good knuckles, properly weighted and balanced, could double the force of a punch. A man with training could do serious damage. And yet these items were still being sold openly in many American towns well into the 20th century. The real turning point came with the rise of organized labor. When strikes became violent, when labor disputes turned into street battles between workers and hired security or police, brass knuckles became associated with organized thuggery. The public perception shifted. These were no longer the tools of individual self-defense. They were the weapons of mobs. And with that perception shift came legislation. What most people don't realize is that the prohibition of brass knuckles and similar weapons wasn't a response to frontier violence. It was a response to industrial violence and urban crime. The frontier had been settled for decades. The wilderness was disappearing. What remained was the chaos of rapid industrialization, the clash between labor and capital, the growth of criminal organizations in cities. The weapons that had been tolerated, even accepted, in isolated rural communities became intolerable in dense urban environments. You can't have every man in a city block carrying brass knuckles. The probability of violence escalates geometrically. A self-defense tool becomes a tool for criminality when the population density rises. And this is where the relationship between frontier weapons and American legal history becomes really clear. The weapons themselves didn't change. The societies that surrounded them changed. The same brass knuckles that were an acceptable part of a miner's toolkit in 1880 became evidence of criminal intent in a city in 1920. The object was identical, but the law had redrawn the boundaries. If you really want to understand the hidden weapons of the frontier, you have to understand this transition. You have to see the moment when American society shifted from rural isolation to urban density and understand how that shift changed the legal status of every single tool and implement that people carried. The weapons that disappeared weren't banned because they suddenly became dangerous. They were banned because American society could no longer tolerate certain kinds of self-reliance. In a rural homestead 50 miles from the nearest town, self-defense was a necessity. In a city, self-defense was a threat to order. The law had to choose which vision of America it wanted to enforce. The choice was already made by the time most people realized what was happening. The frontier weapons didn't disappear because they were replaced by better tools. They disappeared because the society that needed them had been replaced by a society that feared them. If you want to find them now, you have to understand that history. You have to look at the moment when the law changed and understand why it changed and what was lost in that transition. That's where the real history lives. Now, if you want to go deeper into this story, and I mean really deep into the legal documents, the court cases, the manufacturer's catalogs, the actual mechanisms and materials that made these weapons work, I put together a comprehensive resource that you can find in the description and in the pinned comment. This goes way beyond what we can cover in a video. It's the full archive. But here's what most people miss when they look at these weapons and their legal history. They think it's about the weapon itself. They think the government woke up one day and said, that brass knuckle duster is dangerous and made it illegal. That's backwards. The weapons came first, the laws came second, and the laws were written by people who were afraid. In 1910, a man named Solomon Schindler, a newspaper editor in Boston, published an article arguing that working men were arming themselves with concealed weapons at rates that were alarming the establishment. He wasn't wrong. By then, the sap, the knuckle duster, the blackjack, these weren't fringe items anymore. They were mainstream. You could buy them from legitimate suppliers. Traveling salesmen carried catalogs full of them. And the class that had always relied on hired police and private security was beginning to panic. Here's the pattern that repeats across every state that passed these laws. First, there was a crime wave, or the perception of one. Sometimes it was real. Sometimes newspapers just wrote about it more. Second, the middle and upper classes demanded their legislatures do something. Third, legislators passed laws targeting the weapons that working people carried, while conveniently leaving legal the weapons that wealthy people owned. Take the concealed carry laws that started spreading in the 1890s. They didn't ban concealed carrying. That would have been too broad, too obviously targeting the working class. Instead, they required permits that were expensive, permits that required signatures from people of good standing in your community. If you were a coal miner, an immigrant, a laborer, Good luck getting someone who mattered to vouch for you. If you were a banker or a doctor or a landowner, you got your permit by Tuesday. The same thing happened with blackjacks and saps. By 1915, they were illegal in New York. By 1920, illegal in most major cities. But here's what's remarkable, and this is the part that historians usually gloss over. The weapons that the upper class used remained legal or faced minimal restriction. A woman could carry a hat pin, provided it was meant for her hat. A businessman could carry a cane or walking stick, even one weighted with lead or copper, provided it was meant for walking. A farmer could carry a pitchfork or an axe handle, provided it was meant for farming. The intent mattered only if you were poor enough that intent could be assumed against you. Now, there's another layer to this that deserves attention, because these weapons didn't disappear, they evolved. When the blackjack became illegal, the spring-loaded version showed up in catalogues labeled as novelties or self-defense tools. When brass knuckles were banned, people wore them on keychains or as jewelry, technically legal, technically useful, but existing in that grey zone where legality was a negotiation between the person carrying them and the person enforcing the law. And that grey zone is where a lot of people lived. Your great-grandfather might not have carried an illegal blackjack, but he carried a wrench. Your great-grandmother might not have had brass knuckles, but she had a set of heavy curtain rings on a ring. These weren't weapons until they were, and that ambiguity was a form of freedom. What changed fundamentally was that the law stopped looking at whether something was intended to be a weapon. The law started looking at whether something could be used as one. That was a complete inversion of legal logic. Under that new standard, almost everything becomes a weapon. And when everything can be a weapon, the only real power left is the power to choose who gets prosecuted and who doesn't. Let me give you an example that directly connects to our great-grandfather's world. In 1925, a man named Robert Chen, a Chinese immigrant laborer in California, was arrested at a construction site with a length of iron pipe. The pipe was his tool. He used it daily. But a policeman saw it and saw a weapon. The case went to trial. The prosecutor argued that carrying a pipe with the knowledge it could be used as a weapon constituted carrying a concealed weapon. The defense argued it was a tool. The jury convicted him. And that decision, that case, became a precedent. It established that a tool used by a laborer could be reclassified as a weapon based on the officer's perception of intent. It didn't matter that the man was at work. It didn't matter that he needed the pipe for his job. What mattered was that someone in authority decided it was a weapon. Your great-grandfather understood this. He knew that carrying something openly, hanging it on his belt, leaning it against the door, was a declaration. It said, this is what I'm carrying, and I'm not hiding it. And in most places, at most times, that openness kept you safe from the law. The moment you hid something, the moment you concealed it, you shifted the legal calculation. You admitted to yourself, even if only silently, that what you were carrying might be illegal. So he made everything visible. The weapons were there, but they had reasons to be there. The skillet was for cooking. The axe handle was for splitting wood. The walking stick was for walking. The cane was for balance. The whip was for cattle. The weight in the hand was for farm work. Every single item had a cover story, and that cover story was true. But here's what's critical, and this is where Strudy becomes less about weapons and more about control. Once the laws started passing, once intent became something a prosecutor could prove based on where you lived, what your job was, how much money you had, or what color your skin was, the whole system shifted from one where you could openly carry tools to one where you had to manage everyone's perception of you at every moment. That's not freedom. That's a different kind of slavery, a constant awareness that what you're carrying, even if it's legal, might be illegal depending on how someone else interprets it. Now, what's fascinating about studying this history, what separates the real historians from the people just recycling popular narratives, is understanding that these weapons weren't banned because they were particularly deadly. A cast iron skillet isn't more dangerous than a rock. A walking stick isn't more dangerous than a club. The real reason these weapons were banned progressively and selectively was because they represented something else. They represented autonomy. They represented the ability to defend yourself without waiting for permission from the government. And that autonomy, especially among people who didn't have wealth or status, made the people in power nervous. So they passed laws, and they passed them selectively, and they enforced them selectively. And over the course of 50 years, they had effectively disarmed the working class while leaving the upper class with access to exactly the same tools. just with different names and legal frameworks. What I find most interesting, though, and this is where your curiosity should peak, is what happened to the knowledge. Because when these weapons became illegal, the knowledge about how to make them, how to use them, what they were capable of, that knowledge didn't disappear. It went underground. It got passed from father to son in whispers. It got preserved in old manuals and catalogues that people kept hidden. It became forbidden knowledge, which made it more valuable, not less. There are catalogues from the 1880s and 1890s that show weapons that wouldn't be widely available again until the 2000s. That means for over a century, the knowledge existed only in these hidden documents passed along in families that couldn't legally use or manufacture the weapons, but kept the information alive anyway. That's a form of resistance that most histories completely miss. Your great grandfather did more than survive with these weapons. He preserved the knowledge. He understood that someday the laws might matter less than the information. And that's exactly what happened. What was forbidden in 1920 became discussed openly in 1980. What was illegal in 1950 became legal in 2010, not because the weapons changed, because the culture changed, because the knowledge couldn't stay buried forever. And that's the real story here, not the weapons themselves, not the laws themselves, but the way that knowledge, practical, tactical, historical knowledge, moves through culture and time, sometimes underground, sometimes in the light. And what happens when ordinary people decide that their right to protect themselves matters more than the government's right to tell them what they can carry. The men who kept these journals understood something we've largely forgotten in modern America. They knew that the moment you surrender the knowledge of how to defend yourself, you surrender your actual ability to defend yourself. Not because the weapons disappear, because the understanding does. And once understanding is gone, rebuilding it takes generations. Your great grandfather didn't have a cell phone to call for help. He didn't have a police cruiser that could arrive in 8 minutes. He had his knowledge, his hands, and the tools within arm's reach. That wasn't extreme. That was Tuesday. That was survival. And the weapons in his reach weren't evil objects sitting in darkness waiting to corrupt him. They were tools with multiple purposes. The same rolling pin that made bread could be a weapon if it had to be. The same cane that steadied an old man's walk could be used to defend a daughter if a stranger broke down the door. This is what modern law enforcement and lawmakers have lost sight of. The weaponization wasn't in the objects. The weaponization is in the intent. And your great-grandfather understood the difference. A skillet hanging by the bed wasn't evidence of premeditation. It was evidence of a family that slept near the kitchen. A walking stick by the door wasn't a weapon waiting to be used. It was an old man's cane. A leather strap in a satchel wasn't brass knuckles waiting for an excuse. It was a businessman's way to secure his belongings and, if necessary, to secure his life. The shift happened gradually. Around 1960, American culture began to accept a new premise. That safety was something the government would provide, not something you provided for yourself. That protection was a service, not a responsibility. And that the right to defend your family was less important than the government's ability to prosecute you for defending your family. And slowly, the knowledge started to disappear. The journals were burned, the catalogues were discarded. The old men who knew how to improvise, how to create, how to defend with whatever was at hand died, and their knowledge died with them. But here's what matters right now in 2024. That knowledge is returning. Not from the government, not from law enforcement, but from people like you who understand that history is prologue and that understanding how our ancestors survived is essential to understanding how we might survive what comes next. Whether that's economic collapse, civil unrest, natural disaster, or simply a society where the police response time is longer than your family's ability to wait. This is why channels like Forbidden Steel exist. Not to glorify violence, not to encourage illegal activity, but to preserve and present the true history of American self-reliance and self-defense. To show that ordinary people, farmers, merchants, families, women, were capable of extraordinary competence when they understood their own stakes. When they knew that their survival depended on their knowledge and their hands, not on a 911 call or a police report. The weapons themselves are not the lesson. The law is not the lesson. The lesson is in the mindset. Your great-grandfather looked at a problem, a threat to his family, a trespasser on his land, a stranger with bad intentions, and he asked himself, what do I have? What can I use? How do I solve this with what's available to me right now? He didn't ask, is this legal? He asked, is this necessary? And if it was necessary, he acted. The legality was something he negotiated with later, usually with success, because communities understood that a man defending his family against a criminal was doing what a man should do. We've traded that mindset for something else. We've traded competence for compliance. We've traded self-reliance for delegation. And the cost of that trade is becoming obvious. Neighborhoods where crime is rising, but police response times are also rising. Families who call for help and watch the response arrive too late. Communities where the understanding of basic self-defense is fading because schools won't teach it. Because society tells us that weapons and violence are things that only professionals should handle. But here's what I want you to understand. The knowledge can't stay buried. The weapons your great-grandfather kept hidden didn't stay hidden forever. The techniques he used didn't disappear. And the understanding that ordinary people can be competent in their own defense, that's not going away either. It's emerging quietly in forums and channels and conversations among people who understand that the state's monopoly on force is not absolute, and it's certainly not guaranteed to protect you when you need it most. And if you're interested in going deeper into this topic, if you want the real historical documents, the catalogs, the court records, the stories of how ordinary Americans actually defended themselves when the law couldn't or wouldn't help, I've put together a comprehensive resource in the description and in the pinned comment. It goes far beyond what I could cover in a single video, with primary sources, detailed histories, and the actual methods that were used. Check it out. The point of all this, the point of Forbidden Steel, is not to encourage you to break laws or to arm yourself illegally. It's to show you that your ancestors were not primitive, not helpless, and not dependent on the state for their survival. They were competent, creative, and capable of solving complex problems with the tools at hand. And that mindset, that approach to life, that understanding of self-reliance and competence that's valuable, that's worth knowing, that's worth remembering. Because the moment you understand how your ancestors survived, the actual methods, the actual weapons, the actual thinking, you begin to understand how you might survive, not just physically, but culturally, socially, and mentally. You begin to reclaim a part of your heritage that has been deliberately obscured or erased from mainstream history. You begin to think like someone who is capable, rather than like someone who is dependent. And in a world where that kind of thinking is being actively discouraged, where self-reliance is being replaced by compliance, where the very language of personal defense is being criminalized, that matters. That's worth talking about. That's worth knowing.